My name is Kyle Cetrulo, and I'm here with my father, Dr. Curtis Cetrulo, to talk about cord blood and the International Cord Blood Society and the International Perinatal Society. They're two nonprofits that we have both started and run for the last 20 plus years to advance the field of perinatal stem cell science. So, Kurt, when did you start the International Cord Blood Society, and when did that come about and why?
Well, the first meeting was in 1995 on Martha's Vineyard, and we had all of the lead scientists at the time come to the meeting. And as I recall, the meeting was centered around whether or not the private cord blood industry or the public cord blood industry would be the dominating features going forward. And as we know, both of them have thrived over the last 20, 25 years. That was the first International Cord Blood Society meeting. And then we did a second one and a third one. And there was evolution of ideas and thoughts at each one of those meetings. And finally, it ended up with the International Perinatal Stem Cell Society when we realized that there was much more to all of this than just the cord blood aspects of it. And as we've just shown, it ended up, with Wharton's jelly and the amniotic fluid, amniotic membranes, and all of those things eventually came as big discussion and very exciting and interesting lectures as this International Cord Blood Society folded into the Perinatal Stem Cell Society, which looked at all the tissues in pregnancy related to this intermediate group of cells that weren't embryonic cells and were more primitive than adult stem cells. So it was an exciting time in the field, and a lot of people contributed to the society over those many, many years, many of whom are the speakers for this symposium that Kyle's putting together now.
I remember when you first read the article in the New England Journal of Medicine about the first cord blood transplant. And maybe we can go back to what your immediate takeaway was on that. I remember you got all excited and you came marching through the house that I throw these placentas away every day and we're going to use them to treat people's bone marrow transplant. And remember, what was your excitement when you first learned about cord blood?
Well, it was in 1988 and it was in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it was treating a patient with Fanconi's anemia with stem cells, and a very successful treatment. It was done in France, I believe, by Joan Kurtzberg, and it was an exciting time. And as an obstetrician, I felt left out because we hadn't been involved in collecting the cord blood and eventually in placental tissue. So I got very excited as an obstetrician in maternal fetal medicine that we could promote this idea and perhaps treat and save a lot of people's lives. And so I was very excited about that.
I believe it was Elaine Gluckman who was the lead PI on that, but also Hal Broxmeyer was involved, as well as Joanne Kurtzberg and perhaps also John Wagner as well, some of the early pioneers in this space, along with Pablo Rubinstein from New York Cord Blood Bank and David Harris, who ended up starting Cord Blood Registry. When I look back at those meetings, those were the people who were the speakers. And I remember looking at some of the syllabuses. One of them says, cord blood's been used 8 times in this world. And then we had the big paper from Dr. Rubinstein that had 400 plus case studies. And then there was the next big milestone of a sibling transplant. And I remember the very early days of those meetings were really exciting, but also no one knew where it was going. And I felt when we did the 7th International Cord Blood Symposium in 2004 at Tufts New England Medical Center, at that point, cord blood is pretty well established as a source. I think 20,000 plus treatments had been done at that point. And I remember Dr. Francis Verder, who's one of the speakers in this symposium we're putting on, talked about the odds of potentially using it for a cardiac treatment was like 1 in 7. Maybe you can just speak to the potential of these cells that hasn't really been fulfilled, and wonder and why that might be, and what you see as the future for the space, not only for cord blood but for perinatal cells as well.
It's a little perplexing to me why it hasn't been more widely used because it does have the potential to treat so many different diseases. And I think that one of the most important studies along the way, to my way of thinking, because this debate about the private versus the public banks took place at our very first meeting, and there was opposition from many people in academic medicine about the private storage of cord blood, for example. But one of the things that happened with that is that the private collection of the cord blood ended up with the ability to treat siblings who were born with cerebral palsy. If they had saved the cord blood in the first child, they could use that to treat cerebral palsy, which was a very, very exciting thing to be able to do. And Joanne Kurtzberg actually did that study, and she was one of the people who were not very enthusiastic about the private banking of cord blood, and yet she did an eloquent study that showed the value of the private banking and supported both the private banking and the public banking going forward. And that's still being done and widely done. I think there's still a future for all of this that still is exciting to reach the potential that all of these perinatal stem cells have. And specifically, the first and second edition of the perinatal stem cell book that you are involved with emphasizes all of the potential from all of these perinatal stem cell tissues and fluid and everything else.
Yeah, what was really smart when the umbilical cord blood banks, particularly cord blood registry, first was formed in 1995, they didn't have the transplant data, and they needed to get the transplant data to be able to show people that you could use these cord blood units. And that was the big argument from the public banks, is that the odds of actually using it for your own child are very low. And that is true. But what they did is they found families that could really benefit from a sibling transplant. And they created the sibling donor program. And that's how they got most of their transplant numbers and data, by selectively helping these families. I would use the word targeting because it was that as well. They certainly benefited by adding transplant numbers to their inventory, but every family that they helped had great results and really changed their future for those children. And that showed the benefits of the cord blood banking. Now, we've started the International Perinatal Stem Cell Society because in 2008 and 10, we edited those books, the first and second version of the Perinatal Stem Cell Society. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of interest in perinatal stem cells at most of the conferences. There was certainly a lot of interest in the labs around the world, but they weren't getting the same interest as iPS cells and embryonic stem cells, if you recall. Even bone marrow MSCs got more interest at the time. And we just didn't see that changing unless we helped to change it. So we decided to start the Perinatal Society and copy the model that you and Dr. Sabara started for the International Cord Blood Society, how to bring this to the forefront. And I really feel like the success of the Perinatal Society is not only in the education that we've shared, but on the influence we've had in other meetings. If you go to any of the big stem cell meetings, they have a day of perinatal stem cell talks. And that to me was the biggest success, just to change the conversation to the value of these talks. Now, what do you see as the future for the perinatal stem cell space? I know it's a little bit of a, I would even use the word disaster right now, with 361 products and companies that haven't been able to get funding to get through clinical trials. And it's kind of in this middle quagmire zone of companies selling tissue allografts with not a lot of information about the product and not a lot of data, and selling them under the nose of the FDA. And then also the FDA making it very difficult for companies to go through clinical trials to get to market. So it's this kind of two-prong approach that neither prong is that great. What would you suggest to the field on how to advance to actually treat patients? Because that's the goal that everyone wants to get to safely treat patients.
Well, I think the topic of the homologous potential of these cells was not really appreciated by the FDA initially. And I think that now it is, and partly because of all the data from perinatal stem cells, being able to generate the ectoderm, mesoderm, the three different layers of the cells that are produced, and the fact that they are produced so early in fetal life that they can have this homologous imprint on them. And I think that's what needs to be emphasized, especially to the FDA, who is looking at the potential of some of these cells. But I would agree that many of these companies are putting out products, and it's very unclear what the product is, whether it's an expanded sample or it's a more pure sample of the cells. So I think that that's part of what the problem is right now. But that's one that's easily overcome, I think. You just measure what your product is.
Yeah, well, it comes down to the regulatory, because when you start talking about what your product is, that kicks you into a drug discovery pathway, and that's clinical trials. Whereas if you just label your product as a tissue allograft, period, even if you know what's in your product, then you end up in a 361 space. And I think that the FDA's discretionary enforcement policy was not the right policy, because it enabled many companies that just wanted to take advantage of that window to make money to come in, and that diluted the entire market. Like right now, people are selling Wharton's jelly products for $100 a vial, which just doesn't make any sense. It's just basically saline at this point. For me, I'm very frustrated with the space, and I wish that there was a better pathway. And that's why I personally suggest companies to go work in Japan, where you can actually access a conditional approval after a phase 1 study and get to market in that route. So I don't see the pathway in the US until FDA changes things, actually enabling advanced cell therapies to make it to market. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I do. I think that makes a lot of sense, because there are a couple of companies that went to Japan and got the phase 1 studies and then came back with the data to the FDA, which is now being reviewed by some of the studies from Japan. And I think you have to have an open mind that the research and the generation of studies in countries like Japan and even many of the European countries are of value when you're looking at the potential of these cells, because to do those studies in the United States is very, very expensive. And yet the data from these other countries makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that some of the best stem cell treatments are available in Colombia and Mexico and Costa Rica rather than in the United States. I hope in my lifetime we get to see a real change. I remember a long time ago when Mesoblast came out with their cardiac study, you asked the question, when is this going to be available for you? And you could certainly have used that, and currently certainly can use that today, but it's just not available. And that was 10 years ago, where I've been asking the same questions. When is this going to be available for patients? So I'm very excited about the potential for this therapy, and hopefully people in charge of the regulatory pathways can come up with pathways that actually reach patients, particularly with our aging population. Well, thank you for your time today, and thank you for all your work you've done to advance the field of stem cells, cord blood in particular, and perinatal cells as well.
Well, it's been an exciting time to be involved with this, and I would hope that the potential is realized sooner than later.
The Perinatal Stem Cell Society was formed in May 2013, and we're celebrating our 10th anniversary with a large virtual conference. We have 27 new world-class scientists sharing their latest research on perinatal stem cells. And we're also going to include over 50 archived videos from our past conferences that really give a history of perinatal science and perinatal research, both from the academic standpoint, clinical trial standpoint, and commercialization standpoint. We've really been at the forefront and center of the perinatal 361 and 351 pathway revolution, and have many of the most intelligent scientists and business leaders who have presented at our conferences and continue to present at this conference. We also have a very international flavor. We have speakers from Japan, China, Italy, and across the board with some really interesting talks. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you access this vault of information. And when you register, this information is available for lifetime, and you can go at your own pace to go through the 75 plus presentations that we are making available on May 17th. So thank you for your attention, and we look forward to continuing to provide first-class educational materials on the field of perinatal stem cells and tissue.